Hello, I'm John Alterman, Senior Vice President, Director of the Middle East Program and the Zbigniew Brzezinski Chair in Global Security and Geostrategy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I'm delighted to be joined today by someone who I think is one of the most interesting thinkers in Middle East studies today, Professor Steffen Hertog. We'll be talking about Steffen's new element from Cambridge University Press entitled Locked Out of Development, Insiders and Outsiders in Arab Capitalism. Steffen is an associate professor in comparative politics at the London School of Economics and Political Science, or the LSE, and he's written widely about the political economy of the Middle East. His first book, which I have here, Princes, Brokers, and Bureaucrats, Oil and the State in Saudi Arabia, provides unique insight into patronage and performance in the Saudi government. His second book, co-authored with Diego Gambetta, is Engineers of Jihad, the curious connection between violent extremism and education. Prior to joining the LSE in 2010, he served as the Kuwait professor at Sciences Po in Paris. Steffen Hertog, welcome to CSIS.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for having me, John.
So what is this element locked out of development about? What's the core of your argument?
So it's sort of an attempt at a big argument about Arab capitalism, about Arab political economy, against the background that not a lot of big points have been made in that kind of area. So the last big arguments go back all the way to the 1980s, sort of rentier state theory, and no one has kind of tried to explain in a comprehensive fashion what's been going wrong with Arab economic development. And the fundamental argument that I make that I think is descriptively, at least relatively new, is that those systems are uniquely divided into insiders and outsiders. So on the labor market, there are insiders that are very well protected by government, mostly government employees that have very secure tenure, relatively better salaries, quite good social security in comparison. And those are drastically better off than what I call the outsiders, who are mostly people in the private sector who for the most part are informally employed, enjoy no social security and very little social safety. And that's something that you have all over the developing world, all over the global south. But my argument and all the data in that book, I think, shows that these divisions are particularly deep in the Arab world. They're particularly rigid and they're particularly consequential for politics in the region. You have a similar distinction, also in the private sector between insider firms, so cronies who are very closely aligned with government, have very strong informal links to government and enjoy all sorts of protection, and then informal outsider firms who are sort of left with the scraps and sort of in a very tense relationship with the state. And
you're not writing about the whole Middle East, you're writing about countries like Egypt and Jordan, Syria before the revolution.
That's right. So it's sort of what I call the core Arab world, which is sort of a bag of cases at which I arrived sort of by a process of exclusion, because I excluded the very high rent oil-rich economies like the Gulf monarchies most of all, which are just very different types of animals. And I also excluded countries that were in very long-term conflict situations like Lebanon or Iraq, because obviously those war economies are, again, quite a different kind of phenomenon.
And so you talk about insiders and outsiders. How big is the inside group? Are we talking 10%?
So on the labor market, the insider group is unusually large in comparison with other emerging markets or parts of the global south. So you have 20, 30, 40% of employees being government employees, which is very, very high. So there's a very large, if sort of decaying middle class constituency. It's very well protected and sort of alimented, supported by government.
And when did this pattern start?
I think it started sort of during the heyday of Arab nationalism. It really started with Nasser in the 50s and particularly the 60s. So I think this was the original sin. When there was a lot of ideological competition between different Arab regimes. They often outcompeted each other on sort of socialist, distributive pledges, making everyone a member of a new middle class. And Nasser made some pretty, by today's standards, crazy promises, like giving at first in 1961 everyone with a university degree a guaranteed government job. And then in 1964, everyone with a secondary school degree, a degree of a government job, which obviously created huge overemployment and created sorts of promises that those governments have ever since then struggled to really live up to. And the other countries, the other regimes that competed with Egypt ideologically, so Syria, which at the time was actually in a unified government with Egypt from 58 to 61, Iraq, Tunisia, Algeria, but also even the monarchies who were sort of in fear of the Arab Republican revolutions, they all felt that they had to kind of catch up with this and made the same kind of promises and engaged in the same kind of state-driven development project with a very strong redistributive component and very large ambitions in public industry.
When did this begin to run out of steam?
So in Egypt as early as after the 1967 war. So Egypt has always made...
That's pretty fast.
Yeah. It took less than a decade for this really to run into a fiscal crisis and for a lot of those governments to not be able to live up to their promises. And ever since then, you've had this disconnect between governments promising a lot to their people and enshrining in law all sorts of social and employment guarantees and an actual fiscal situation where they couldn't deliver for everyone, as a result of which you then had this insider constituency, so the people who still had access to those pledges, to that kind of patronage, and then growing numbers of outsiders, especially new graduates, later generations that then didn't get access to that kind of old social contract anymore.
But if this starts falling apart in the late 1960s, early 1970s, and the governments are trying to pivot away, many of them stopped guaranteeing employment decades ago, why does the pattern persist after decades of trying to move away?
That's a great question. I think there are two parts to sort of my tentative answer. One is that despite the fiscal crisis, those governments continued to expand for a very long time. So in Egypt, the share of public employment and total employment and the absolute number of public employees increased all the way until the 1990s. So there were ever larger cohorts of especially young citizens with university degrees who then couldn't get access to that system, but there was still a significant share who did get access to that kind of patronage. And the same would be the case in Syria or in Tunisia. And there was never anything to really replace this old kind of social contract. But
even in the 1990s or 30 years ago.
Yeah, that's true. And the decay has been, the rot has set in decades ago. I think the fact that there has been such little growth in productivity, such little growth in non-oil exports, it all has to do with the fact that those economies operate on the back of a very old, very distortionary and very sort of exclusive distributional system that undermines incentives both on the labor market and for firms to actually perform.
What would you make of the argument that this really didn't start in the 1960s, that this didn't even start in the Mandate period, that this is the way Middle Eastern political economy has been operating since Ottoman times? You had Albert Harani wrote a classic article in 1966 on Ottoman reform and the politics of notables, describing what was happening in the 19th century. To what extent do we have a long legacy of Middle Eastern political economy that's all about insiders taking care of insiders, and probably majority of the people being consistently marginalized and exploited?
I think 2 points there. One is that I think there's a longer legacy of sort of state dominance of the private sector and of deep state intervention and of a relatively weak private sector. So that goes back certainly to Ottoman times, and there are all these longue durée arguments by people like Timur Kuran who argue that it's partially rooted in facets of Islamic law, that you didn't have the emergence of sort of modern corporations as independent legal entities that would allow a thriving private sector. So I think that there's something to that. But the insider coalitions that you would have had before the 1950s were all very, very small. So I think this big mass pledge, this promise to make everyone a member of the middle class, and those promises to give everyone a government job, that is really something that only took off in the age of Arab nationalist competition, when Arab nationalism had become sort of a socialist project rather than sort of a bourgeois liberal project like it was before the Second World War.
Is this really different from other parts of the world, places like Latin America?
I think to an important extent, yes. So I think that it's true that there has been patronage politics, and there have been state-driven sort of top-down development projects all over the global south. But I think the extent of ideological competition that pushed regimes into sort of more extreme positions and more intense state intervention, I think that's more pronounced in the Arab world. So if you go back all the way to the 50s and 60s and look at the depth of state intervention in terms of nationalizations, in terms of the share of state spending in total consumption or total capital formation, it's always been a lot higher even than during the kind of more left-leaning phases of Latin American or sub-Saharan African politics. So John Waterbury, the great political economist of Egypt, he says in his big book about the Egyptian political economy that there's practically no country outside of the communist sphere that has engaged in as much of a socialist development drive and has marginalized the private sector as much as Egypt. And I think the same would be true even more for Syria and also for Tunisia, at least in the early phase before the 1960s sort of partial liberalization. It's certainly true for Algeria, which had an extremely statist development project.
I remember talking to an economist at the World Bank in the early 2000s who described the Syrian political economy as like a museum piece of what East Bloc economies used to be, and the only one left standing is in Syria.
I think that's quite true, and a lot of the regulations of that era in one form or another have actually survived. So that even nowadays there's still deeper intervention in terms of non-tariff trade barriers, in terms of licensing regime, in terms of barriers to access for companies that are not in some way connected to governing elites.
Again, why is this so durable?
So I think there's some sort of historical accidents that have helped the system survive. One of them is that some of those countries have gotten external support for a long time. So Syria through the Soviet Union, Egypt through the United States for a long time, Algeria on the back of its relatively modest but still sizable hydrocarbons rents. It was never forced to undergo a structural adjustment program the way that some sub-Saharan African countries, for example, were forced to let go of almost half of their public sector workforce in a matter of a few years. So there's never this kind of externally imposed shock therapy. But there are also kind of structural political reasons that I engage with more in the book in terms of the political feedback loops that those insider-outsider systems create. So once you create those insider constituencies on the basis of a certain moral economy of distribution, an expectation that the state takes care of you, it becomes very, very hard to take that away. So if you look at attempts at subsidy reform, public sector reform across the region, those insiders, those kind of Nasserist public sector employees, they've historically been quite good at defending their interests, even if there was no formal kind of political pluralism to allow them to do so. But the bread riots in Egypt in 1977, where everyone thinks these were like the downtrodden, the people from the poor quarters, the informal workers, it was actually middle-class bureaucrats and people and well-paid industrial workers from state-owned enterprises that demonstrated the most vociferously. So I think it's the expectation of the social contract that is so deeply ensconced both among people benefiting from it and sort of the regimes that provide for this, even if sort of it's a decaying system. And also the inability of outsiders to organize. You know, informally employed workers or informal firms, they're very busy with daily survival. They don't have sort of a coherent ideology to organize around. And they're very atomized socially, so it's very, very hard to mobilize them as a political constituency. It's much easier to get sort of the employees of the Mugamma at Tahrir Square in Egypt to go out and demonstrate against pensions reform or public sector consolidation.
Perhaps the reason they're turning the Mugamma into a 5-star hotel in Cairo.
I think the Mugamma, this huge bureaucratic complex that's sort of emblematic of everything that's wrong with the immovable.
Although planned under the monarchy, of course.
Yeah. But that's sort of the symbol of everything that's wrong with the Arab bureaucracy. I think the fact that they've tried to knock it down for 20 years and they just can't. You know, I think it's really symptomatic of what's going on in the public sector more broadly.
Then you had talked, we were talking earlier, you talked about the main labor union in Tunisia being an example of one of these really powerful groups.
Exactly. And I mean, the UGTT has done great things for the temporary democratic transition in Tunisia as a guarantor of this compromise between the Islamists and the sort of liberal nationalist forces and the leftovers of the old regime. But in terms of political economy, they're a cartel that defends insider interests. They represent essentially public sector employees and a small minority of formally employed private sector employees. And they do very little for the unemployed. They do very little for informally employed or people on precarious temporary contracts. And there's some organizations trying to organize these other groups that are very much in conflict, or at least in tension, with the UGTT. And it's very much sort of insider status quo defense, and it's not dissimilar from what's happening in Europe, where, say, in Germany, the big powerful unions in the industrial sector, they defend insiders, people on permanent, very well-protected contracts, and they've for many years even refused the introduction of a minimum wage for the broader economy, because they thought that would sort of violate their institutional autonomy to negotiate with employers. So it's a very similar kind of insider-outsider system in some way to what you have in parts of Europe.
So, of course, the international financial institutions always talk about inclusive growth. We just had spring meetings. There's, I think, some here in Washington, there's some anxiety about what the weakening economies in the Middle East might mean for a lot of these marginalized groups. In your judgment, have these institutions been helpful or harmful in moving away from these kinds of structures? Mm-hmm. And what would make them more effective?
So I think historically, especially in the 80s and 90s, they did get a lot wrong. So the kind of the classical Washington consensus was probably too sort of market fundamentalist at the time, and was just about mostly state withdrawal and fiscal consolidation. I think what they missed was the chance to convert the old system that benefits the insiders and neglects the outsiders into a system that provides more comprehensive social cover for everyone. So the insiders have to give up a bit of their privileges. They can't all have an ironclad government job guarantee until the end of their life with sort of a pension replacement rate, where in some cases they get a higher pension even
Sounds
than
like
their final
tenure
salary. Yeah. But it's tenure for 5 million people in Egypt, right? There has to be some social compromise where the insiders give up a little bit, but the outsiders, and this is the constituency that I'm really politically and morally concerned about, where they get much more support. Because the insider social benefits and salaries eat up so much fiscal resources that there's very little left for basic cash grants, non-contributory pensions, support in training, or sort of micro-entrepreneurship, the things that could benefit the genuinely poor and desperate. And unfortunately, at the time when there would have been the opportunity, not enough was sort of reinvested in that direction. Instead, it was just fiscal consolidation and sort of shrinkage. And now, in many cases, it's so late. The fiscal situation is so dire that it's much harder to come up with a kind of new social contract. I mean, to be fair, the IMF now is wiser, and it even tells the Tunisian government, for example, you have to reduce your crazily high government salary budget and redistribute some of that money for social safety spending for the poor. That's perfectly reasonable, but it's just pretty late in the day.
So as I say, I'm curious both what they can do to be more effective, but I'm also curious how you make the politics work.
Yeah.
If the fear is that the people who are currently relying on these insider benefits feel like they're hanging on by their fingernails,
yeah,
and the people who are outside don't have any confidence this is actually going to work.
Yeah.
So how do you create
I think that
the assurance to make it work?
That is indeed a really dicey puzzle. And you need donor support for the transition, because you can't be brutal and shrink the public sector workforce by 20% overnight or something like this. You have to give people reasonable exit options like golden handshakes, early pensions deals that will cost some money in the short to medium term, but in the long run bring the state apparatus to a size that's more sustainable and is also more functionally appropriate, make the bureaucracy more efficient. And you need money to support the outsiders for a new social contract, and that has to happen early. And they need to see that. They won't believe that this is actually happening until they get their unconditional cash grant or their wage top-up or whatever they might benefit from. And currently, outsiders, they often demonstrate and just ask for insider benefits because that's sort of the political vocabulary they're used to. So in poor cities in the Tunisian periphery, people go out and say, we want one government job for every family. That's perfectly reasonable and rational from their perspective, but sort of as an economic development policy, that's obviously catastrophic.
A lot of the Gulf governments have been major donors to a lot of the countries you talk about in the book. What role have the Gulf governments played in sustaining, enabling, protecting these kinds of systems, and what role might they play to make the transition that you're talking about?
That's an excellent question. I think it's two questions, and the answers are very separate, I think, because historically, a lot of Saudi money in particular was largely unconditional. Right? It was just depositing money in the central bank or giving soft loans or direct grants to the Egyptian government in particular, and they just used that to continue operating a very unfair, very exclusive, very inefficient system for a couple of years more. There's been a real structural shift in that the Saudis in particular now are very much aligned with the IMF agenda of wanting to see real structural reform. They want to see even the military stepping back from its very heavy role in the Egyptian economy, and the military seems to be finding all sorts of back alley ways to try to avoid that. But there's a new constellation where I think you have Saudi financial muscle and the kind of technocratic supervision of the IMF potentially coalescing into something that could push Egypt into more serious reforms. The risk, of course, is that the fiscal situation is so dire that they really can't do enough to maintain the social peace and to build the kind of more comprehensive social safety nets that the country really needs.
I want to talk about that in a second, but it seems that the Gulf governments are particularly weak position to advance these kinds of reforms because they are sort of the uber insider economies. Citizens have lifetime employment. Yep. Citizens have increased access to capital. I mean, how can they talk about creating societies that are more egalitarian when the nature of Gulf economies is insiders, i.e. citizens, have absolutely remarkable benefits that accrue to being a citizen?
I think that's very much true, and I've actually written a separate paper about sort of insiders and outsiders in Gulf labor markets, where there's an interesting change, though, in that Mohammed bin Salman, for example, and in Saudi Arabia, and even Mohammed bin Zayed in the Emirates to some extent, they've actually closed the door to public sector recruitment to new cohorts of citizens who are used to the old social contract of getting some more or less meaningless degree in a provincial university, putting yourself on the civil service waiting list, and then getting a plum job. Actually, that's pretty much over in Saudi Arabia. So it's not that there have been large-scale redundancies in the public sector, so the old stock of insiders is safe. But they're actually creating a new tier of outsiders who are now under pressure to find jobs in the private sector. So they could even tell the Egyptians, look, we're imposing tough medicine on our own people. You should do the same if you want our money. And obviously, the other factor is that it's the Saudis' own money, and they would have the fiscal capacity to actually maintain the old social contract for much longer than the Egyptians.
Can we talk about Egypt? What role did the phenomena that you're describing in this book play in the 2011 revolution? So if we are to believe the survey data and the qualitative work that's been done, it was actually disproportionately insiders who demonstrated. So public sector employees, the old middle class, because exactly as you said before, they were afraid of losing their old entitlements, of the old social contract becoming threadbare and falling apart. It's not only there that those insider-outsider distinctions have shaped the way that protest has happened. If you look at Tunisia, for example, it tended to be, on the other hand, outsiders, so young graduates who didn't have access to the old social contract who demonstrated. So in different ways, in quite different ways, it has actually structured protest and sort of social demands. Was there a way the government could have dealt with it differently than it did?
I mean, what governments all over the region did, to the extent that they weren't overthrown, was just to double down on the old system. increase salaries in the public sector, hire more in the public sector, roll back certain subsidy reforms, and subsidies also tend to disproportionately benefit insiders because they're higher income usually. I guess, if they'd had more time and if there'd been more trust in government, they could have done something more comprehensive. But of course, it was so late in the day, and the security and the political situation was so acute that they fell back to this old vocab. So in a sense, it was too late at that moment. It was clear that they'd fall back into old patterns.
So where do you see Egypt now in terms of the phenomena that you're describing in this book?
So through all the devaluations previously of the Egyptian pound, there's always been some reestablishment of insider privileges afterwards. So in the most recent labor force survey data that's publicly available, you can still see that if you're working in the public sector, you have a higher hourly wage than even people with a formal contract in the private sector, and obviously much better general fringe benefits in terms of job security, short working hours, pensions entitlements, and all of this. So until very recently, although everyone was getting worse off, the relative difference between insiders and outsiders kind of was stable. With the most recent, more dramatic wave of devaluation and fiscal crisis, I'm not so sure this is going to be the case going forward. So it could actually be that the old insider-outsider system kind of breaks apart, but just through complete exhaustion of the model, through essentially comprehensive pauperization. Everyone's going to be an outsider in a sense. So that's what happens if you don't fix the system early enough. And that, in a way, that could be the future of other Arab countries that are on the same road, just haven't traveled down quite as far as Egypt.
Would that be a way to address the concerns you have about insider-outsider tensions, that basically everybody becomes an outsider? Is that...
I don't want everyone to become desperate. I mean, it's not a good way of resolving that issue. I mean, there is a path where theoretically in the long run, production costs, labor costs are so low that Egypt starts becoming competitive as an exporter. But the path to there is so painful and has to go through so much poverty and destitution that there would have been ways to redirect resources and come up with a more inclusive social contract much earlier. Perhaps it's what has to happen in Egypt, but it's very, very
What does an inclusive social contract look like in Egypt, and how do you get there?
It would mean, for example, that you have less sort of Bismarckian-style social security. So
help me understand that.
Yeah,
I'm an American, not a European.
I'll explain. So that social benefits, health insurance, pensions are not tied to formal employment, but they're generally tax financed, so they're available for everyone. They won't be as generous, but they'll be more inclusive. Everyone can have them based on sort of a means testing mechanism. There would be a general state pension that everyone in principle is entitled to. There'd be unemployment assistance that you can get even if you haven't contributed formally to an unemployment insurance. So a more widespread, less generous, but more inclusive social safety net.
Are you concerned that the way the Egyptian government is going to feel it has to square the circle is not by providing broader benefits, not by providing greater participation, but by just turning up repression?
It's definitely what's already been happening. I think.
Is there a limit to it?
It's a good question where the breaking point is. I mean, I haven't been in Egypt for a while, but so my sense from remote is that people are just so desperate and fatigued that I'm not sure there's a lot of revolutionary potential anymore. So I think the regime might get away with, having driven the country into poverty because it's got repressive capacity and because people are just so busy with daily survival. But that's just a sort of a hunch.
Although Egypt, with 100 million people, still has 10 million relatively well-off people.
Yeah. I mean, I think Sisi is so much more repressive than Mubarak was, and he's demonstrated that. I'm speculating now, but I don't see right now sort of large-scale social unrest as the most likely scenario, even if things get even worse. I mean, there could be a palace coup, right? There could be factions within the military deciding to remove Sisi because of economic mismanagement, but I don't see a faction within the military that would be necessarily much better at economic management.
So how do we dig out of this? I mean, what's the process, the economic process, the international role, the domestic political process? What are we trying to build toward, and how do we get on that road?
I think donors have to play a key role. I think the fact that Saudi money is potentially aligned with the IMF and that the IMF has become at least somewhat more reasonable on social safety mechanisms rather than just fiscal consolidation, I think that bears some promise. But I think there also has to be more systematic public debate about what a new social contract could look like. Everyone's been clinging to those old Nasserist promises from the 1960s. I think there has to be a more proactive vision of, how can the government provide for people in a way that's not distortionary, that's not exclusive, and that's actually pro-growth, that could actually allow people to accumulate skills, take risks, become entrepreneurial.
Does that have an ideological flavor, an ideological element, or is it a sort of technocratic?
It would be sort of a very, very threadbare version, essentially, of Scandinavian labor markets, right? So sort of flex security idea that labor markets or the economy, they're flexible, right? You're not entitled to lifelong employment, but if you fall out of employment, fall on hard times, there's someone there to support you.
It strikes me as hard to implant Scandinavian mores into the Middle East.
I mean, if you look at Latin America, that's actually a region where there's been huge progress on anti-poverty and social inclusion through much more dynamic drive into modern social safety mechanisms that are not based on having a formal contract or being a government employee. And to some extent, that happened in the course of democratic transitions, when new political forces managed to mobilize outsider groups, the very, very large constituencies of informally employed in shanty towns. Obviously, we don't have that kind of democratic window in the Middle East, but I'm saying that in principle, it's possible.
Do you think we might?
After Tunisia, I'm very, very pessimistic. I mean, Tunisia had that window, and there would have been an opportunity for a decade to mobilize outsiders and negotiate a new social contract, and everyone just kind of fell back onto these old patterns. So not in the near future, unfortunately. I think it has to be an enlightened autocrat more than a democratic challenger.
I have a few more questions, and then if members of the audience want to submit questions, if you're watching online, you can just click the Ask a Question button. You can put a comment into the YouTube video. Steffen, I start my day with the knowledge that most people care a lot less about the Middle East than I do. And much of Washington seems to have concluded that the United States doesn't really have strategic interests left in the Middle East and should be looking for the door. Given that reality, why should American policymakers, why should European policymakers be seized with the problem you're describing in your book?
Well, I think for Europeans in particular, there's obviously the migration threat, right? So Tunisia is coming apart at the seams economically under an incompetent and dictatorial president, and there will be growing numbers of Tunisian economic refugees in Europe. So just out of that, of the self-interest of managing or containing that, I think European policymakers in particular should think about what they can do to nudge the region towards a new, more inclusive social contract. I think the American strategic interest in North Africa definitely is more diffuse, but when things really come apart socioeconomically, you get security problems, right? So the re-emergence of the Islamic State across North Africa, it always happened in places where government failed, where socioeconomics failed, and as a result, social peace came apart. So it's not an acute threat right now, but you've seen it on the Sinai in Egypt, you've seen it in parts of North Africa. So that's definitely a threat that's still on the horizon.
And then let me ask, given the reduced confidence in U.S. staying power, the reduced confidence in the U.S. role, how does that shape, in your mind as a European, how the U.S. should be approaching these kinds of issues in the region?
That's a good question. I guess for sort of North Africa, one advantage compared to the Gulf region is that it's probably a bit less of a political football in domestic politics in the United States. Right? So Saudi Arabia and the relationship to MBS became such an election issue and a cudgel to beat up Trump with, that American policy really became very, very much driven by domestic kind of electoral concerns. I think there's less of a debate on North Africa that actually gives policymakers a little bit more autonomy and perhaps a bit more space for bipartisan consensus among the reasonable factions on both sides to think about what to do with Tunisia or Egypt. So in a way, the reduced visibility domestically might actually be good for American policy vis-a-vis North Africa.
We have a question from Anis Azuni from Azuni & Associates. He asks you to elaborate on insiders' role constraining institutional reform.
So there are a couple of dimensions there. I mean, one aspect of sort of insiderdom that I haven't elaborated much on, but which is very important, are the insider businesses, so essentially the crony capitalists. This is a much smaller constituency than the labor market insiders and the public sector employees, but they're very, very economically consequential. And they were, in many ways, one of the drivers of the Arab uprisings, of the Arab Spring in 2010, 2011, when people were so upset about high-level corruption and the cronies around Mubarak and the Ben Ali family in Tunisia. And I think they do undermine institutions because there's so much informal favoritism and nepotism between government institutions, the bureaucracy, and those types of businesses that undermine the level playing field, that create barriers to entry for firms who are not insiders. So I think in that sense, institutional capacity, especially in economic regulation, is very much undermined. The other way in which it is undermined is that if you give jobs in the public sector in order to keep social peace, rather than recruiting people in the public sector as a function of what the public sector actually needs to function well, you undermine bureaucratic efficiency. And we're back to the Mugamma, right? We're back to people sipping tea, drinking, reading the newspaper all day, sitting on this shrinking Nasser-era sinecure, but not actually doing the work.
While we're in Egypt, I want to talk to you about the new administrative capital. About 50 kilometers outside of Cairo to the northeast. What do you think is going on? What does it mean for the model you've been describing? What does it tell us about the way Egypt operates?
Well, I'm not sort of on the inside track on that one, but it definitely has created a whole host of very large construction contracts. And the beneficiaries of those types of contracts tend to be firms that are well connected, that are close to the regime. So apart from Sisi's delusions of grandeur of building a new Egypt, I think there's also just a lot of garden variety cronyism and paying off of insiders on the business side going on there. The construction contracts are like a prime currency in that kind of transaction.
And the military certainly has a
major
role.
Military side. Yeah.
We have a question from Will Todman. To what extent should municipality officials and other local government officials be considered insiders? In some MENA countries, local governments are expected to play a larger role in local service provision as the central state cuts back, but they often have insufficient budgets. Should donors try to find ways to support decentralization by increasing their support to municipalities?
There are a couple of layers to that. One is that the insider-outsider distinction conceptually is quite stark, but empirically there are shades of gray. Like you can have pretty bad jobs in the public sector. You can also have a temporary contract in the public sector, and then you're kind of somewhere between insider and outsider. So there are a lot of nuances, and there's certainly people sort of employed in municipalities or in the teaching profession who are sort of on the margins of insiderdom. They still have some of the benefits, but it's a pretty bad deal. On decentralization, I think this will only work if there's real political buy-in at the top, because those are very, very heavily centralized bureaucratic systems. So even if you want to support that from the outside, as long as everyone then still has to push the paper all the way back to Cairo, it's not going to work. So if you want to make that work, I think you need buy-in at the minister level or perhaps the presidential level.
So let me ask you the insider question. I mean, lobbying is a multi-billion-dollar industry in Washington, in a country with as much economic opportunity as the United States. There's a huge effort to become an insider,
Yep.
in a sense that even in largely functioning democratic countries, there are people who are insiders.
Oh yeah.
How do you address that, or is it just that there's a lower level of insiderness and you can improve by degrees, but not have a purely egalitarian system?
I think the simple answer is that it's just much more extreme in those Arab countries. And you see that in statistics on the size distribution of companies, that those economies are dominated by, on the one hand, a huge number of small informal firms, and then a very small number of very big, very well-connected firms. And there are very few productive mid-sized firms. So it's a very skewed size distribution. And those big companies, if you look at who's on their board, who the owners are, they're politically connected. So there's a very sort of bimodal distribution that's more extreme than in other countries. If you look at recent, very interesting statistical research on crony capitalism in various Arab countries, there are really striking statistics that firms with political connections to Mubarak, in the Mubarak era, for example, had something like 20% of employment of listed firms, but 60% of the total profits of listed firms. So just the scale of insider benefits is very large, and it's larger than we've seen it in sort of statistical research on other countries. Firms are older, there's less firm entry, so it's harder to, there are fewer LLCs registered, which is sort of the main route to becoming a profitable, normal mid-sized firm. There's less dynamism, so everything points towards sort of more rigid insider-outsider boundaries and a more safe and protected insider status in the private sector.
Professor Gregory Gaw has asked, there are Middle Eastern countries that have gone through the kind of change you're talking about, most notably Turkey and Israel. Mm-hmm. How could they do it and the Arab countries are not able to do it?
That's a good question. I think Turkey has had sort of a longer track record of well, not more autonomous, but sort of higher powered bourgeoisie. So even in the sort of more state-driven era of early Kemalist economic development, there was more space for the bourgeoisie and for private capital. So they just had a much longer sort of run-up to the period of eventual liberalization. They never went as kind of state socialist as Egypt or Syria or Algeria went. And even among the Arab countries, there are shades of gray. So Morocco, for example, has a much larger and relatively more autonomous private sector and a smaller sort of insider constituency among public sector employees. I'm not an expert on Israel, but again, public sector employment has never been sort of as politically and socially dominant, and there's never been as much of a social contract based on that, even in Israel under the old labor governments as in the Arab countries.
I know you're not an expert on China, mm-hmm. but China seems to have navigated this with state-owned enterprises and a sense of responsibility, but still has been able to grow a substantial private sector that provides employment. Have you thought about the China experience and what it might mm-hmm. offer to Middle Eastern states?
It's had a couple of ingredients that the Arab world, by and large, doesn't have. One is that, again, state employment was never quite as large and dominant in China. And there was a very large sort of agricultural surplus labor force that moved to industrial centers, that moved to cities, and could be employed very cheaply. So they could compete on labor cost in manufacturing. And even nowadays, labor cost relative to productivity in the Arab world is not attractive to most foreign investors. So compared to Indonesia or parts of sub-Saharan Africa, it's a relatively high-cost place to produce.
It's partly about cost, but it's also partly about productivity.
Yeah, it's the ratio. So the unit labor cost, so the amount of money you have to spend to produce something per unit of labor are pretty high actually in the Arab world.
Why do you think that is?
Partially it's skill systems that are very weak, and I got a small chapter in the book on skill systems. Historically, education systems prioritized quantity over quality in the Arab world. Again, it goes back to the old social contract. Everyone was essentially promised a route to a university degree. And as a result, you had to expand those systems so rapidly that quality really suffered. And there's a disproportionate share of people with humanities and arts degrees, which is not as such necessarily a bad thing. But in the context of the Arab world, this was because you could ramp up those programs the most cheaply and the most shoddily. So a lot of people with those degrees are essentially unemployable in terms of their skill set. And then the labor market, with its insider and outsider rigidities and the very low chance of outsiders to become insiders, also doesn't really give good incentives for skills acquisition. Because if you're an outsider, informally employed, driving a taxi or fixing mopeds, there's no great payoff to having high skills. In some forms of insider employment in the private sector, the returns to skills might be higher, but those are jobs that are very, very hard to get. There's very, very low mobility between insider and outsider status. So the returns to actually investing in skills are very low for most citizens.
Certainly when I was in Egypt, the argument was that most government employees have 2 other jobs. So they come in late, they work their government job, they get whatever minimal benefits they get, and then they drive a taxi, and then they do something else. So it seems that there's the whole...
That's true.
The whole range.
That's very wide-scale moonlighting, which shows you that insider status is not great. Those are not great middle-class jobs. Those people are also poor and suffering. They're just still relatively better off than a genuine outsiders. It's just still much better to sip tea at the Mogama for 6 hours and then drive a taxi than to only be a taxi driver.
I was struck that as your book was really starkly portraying a number of challenges in the region. Access to capital didn't figure very prominently. Mm-hmm. And access to capital is, of course, the fundamental argument of Marxist thought. Why don't you think that's such a significant piece of what's going on?
There's one sentence in the chapter on the private sector, insiders and outsiders in the private sector, where I point to research, I think by Ishaq Diwan and some other economist, showing that something like 90% of credit in the Egyptian economy actually goes to politically connected firms. So that would be your answer. It's just one other channel of protection and privilege for insider firms. And those insider firms are so well protected that they really don't have to worry that much about being productive or investing in technology, which is another reason for why there's so little progress on total factor productivity or competitive exports or anything.
But I wonder if you're looking for a solution set, one is for these Middle Eastern states to become more like Europe, where you have a strong social safety net and basically capitalist systems, and another is to find ways through microfinance or other ways to access capital to grow the outside economy. If the inside economy atrophies, then is that an alternative pathway to get to the place you're trying to go?
I think the two are perfectly complementary, right? Because one would deal with the labor market rigidities and the inefficiencies of insider-outsider system. The other would deal with the inefficiencies of the private sector and the distinctions between insider firms and outsider firms.
Let me ask a final question, and that's about brain drain. Basically, exit voice and loyalty, and people just decide, I'm not going to play this game anymore. What role does the potential for brain drain have in incentivizing governments, forcing governments, or providing safety valves for governments that are unable to do the kinds of things you're talking about?
I think it's probably more of a safety valve. If you are able to get rid of well-skilled, highly motivated young citizens who are frustrated because this rigid labor market doesn't have anything to offer to them, and they migrate out. That's, I think, politically that's a plus, even if economically it's a loss for that system. And I show in the book that returns to education, returns to skills are uniquely low. So for an extra year of education, the return that you get in terms of extra salary are uniquely low in the Arab world, and that does push people into exactly that kind of brain drain behavior.
Do you think there's going to be a lot more out-migration over the next 15 years, if you had to bet?
Certainly the push factors will, in the short to medium run, become stronger with Tunisia hitting a wall economically. Now they're struggling to pay even government salaries for insiders. With Egypt reaching a point of complete destitution. The question is how brutal Europe is in cracking down on that kind of migration.
Chilling thoughts. Steffen Hertog, author of Locked Out of Development, Insiders and Outsiders in Arab Capitalism. Thank you for joining us at CSS today.
Thanks a lot, John.